Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we journey to the frozen edge of the world, to the Arctic Ocean, where pack ice shifts and grinds, where the sun disappears for months at a time, and where a massive steel ship became something more than a vessel. It became a ghost. The SS Baychimo was not a passenger liner carrying hopeful immigrants or a warship bristling with guns. It was a cargo steamer built for one purpose: to haul pelts through the most dangerous waters on Earth. And yet, this unremarkable ship would become one of the most enduring maritime mysteries of the 20th century. But before we set sail into these frozen waters, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring history's most compelling mysteries. Picture this: a 400-foot steel vessel, abandoned in 1931 after becoming trapped in Arctic ice. The crew escapes. Everyone assumes the ship will sink within days, but it doesn't sink. Instead, it drifts. For 38 years, it appears and disappears in the Arctic fog, sometimes with lights still burning, sometimes covered in ice, always empty. Inuit hunters spot it. Other ships encounter it. Salvage crews try to board it. And then, one day in 1969, it vanishes for the last time and is never seen again. Now, settle in as we follow the SS Baychimo from her construction to her final disappearance into the Arctic mist. Imagine the Arctic Ocean in winter. The water is not the blue of tropical seas, or even the grey of temperate oceans. It's nearly black, so dark it seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. The cold of this water defies description. At -2 Celsius, it's actually below the freezing point of fresh water. Only the salt content keeps it liquid. A human body loses heat 25 times faster in water than in air at the same temperature. In Arctic water, you have perhaps 5 minutes before losing consciousness, 10 minutes before death. The sky in winter merges with the ice in seamless grey. Horizon disappears. Distance becomes impossible to judge. What looks like it might be a mile away could be 10 miles. What looks like solid ground could be open water covered in thin ice. Arctic travelers speak of this disorientation as one of the most dangerous aspects of the environment. When you can't trust your eyes, navigation becomes treacherous. And the ice. Think carefully about what ice means in the Arctic. Pack ice, the permanent ice that covers much of the Arctic Ocean year-round, is not like lake ice or river ice. It's not like ice in your freezer. Pack ice forms in sheets that can be 10, 15, 20 feet thick. These sheets, called floes, extend for miles. They don't stay still. Currents push them. Wind moves them. They grind against each other constantly. When two massive ice floes collide, the pressure creates something called pressure ridges. The ice doesn't just crack, it buckles upward, creating walls and mountains of broken ice. Some pressure ridges reach heights of 30 or 40 feet, looking like mountain ranges made of jumbled ice blocks. Between the floes leads open channels of dark water. These leads appear suddenly when ice shifts, and close just as suddenly. A ship caught in a closing lead faces pressure that can crush steel like paper. Ships designed for Arctic operations need extraordinary strength. Normal ship hulls are built to handle water pressure and wave action. Arctic ship hulls must handle ice pressure that can reach thousands of pounds per square inch. The steel must remain flexible at temperatures where normal steel becomes brittle and fails. Every aspect of design must account for conditions that would destroy conventional vessels. Despite these challenges, despite the danger, despite the cost and risk, ships have been venturing into Arctic waters for centuries. Why? Because the Arctic contains things people want: whales in earlier centuries, furs in the era we're exploring, oil and minerals in modern times. And now, increasingly, the Arctic matters because climate change is opening navigation routes that were previously impassable. But in 1931, none of this future was visible. The Arctic was remote, dangerous, and largely unmapped. Ships that ventured into these waters did so for one reason: profit. The Hudson's Bay Company sent the Baychimo north every summer because the fur trade was extremely profitable. Profitable enough to risk ships and crews in conditions that killed regularly. This is the world the Baychimo entered. This is where she spent her working life, and where she spent her drifting years. This is where she vanished. The Arctic, beautiful and deadly, indifferent and absolute. Let's explore how one ship became eternal by disappearing into this frozen realm. To understand the Baychimo's story, we must first understand why anyone would voluntarily sail into the Arctic in the 1920s and 30s. The answer is simple: fur. But simple answers rarely tell the full story. Fur wasn't just commerce in the early 20th century, it was wealth on a scale difficult to comprehend today. A single fine beaver pelt could sell for what a factory worker earned in a month. A coat made from Arctic fox fur cost as much as a house. Wealthy women in New York, London, and Paris competed to display the finest furs. Fashion magazines devoted pages to fur styles. Department stores built entire sections around fur sales. The Hudson's Bay Company understood this market better than anyone. Founded in 1670, they had built a commercial empire on fur trading. For over 2 centuries, they maintained trading posts across northern Canada, exchanging manufactured goods with indigenous peoples for pelts. By the 1920s, this was still enormously profitable business. But the best furs came from the far north. Arctic fox, in particular, produced pelts of exceptional quality. The extreme cold meant animals developed thick, luxurious fur. The remoteness meant populations remained healthy and numerous. But accessing these northern regions presented enormous challenges. Overland travel was nearly impossible. The Arctic territories of northern Canada and Alaska contain some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Permafrost prevents normal road construction. The land is crisscrossed with rivers and lakes that freeze solid in winter and become impassable swamps in summer. Forests give way to tundra, endless flat expanses where navigation is difficult and shelter non-existent. The only practical way to supply remote northern trading posts was by sea. Every summer, when the Arctic ice temporarily retreated, ships could navigate along the northern coast, reaching settlements that were otherwise inaccessible. These supply runs were dangerous and expensive, but the profits made the risk worthwhile. The Baychimo was built specifically for this purpose. Constructed in 1921 at a Swedish shipyard that specialized in ice-capable vessels, she was designed to navigate Arctic waters. Her specifications reflected this specialized role. She was 230 feet long and displaced 1,300 tons. Her steel hull was double-plated, 2 layers of steel with space between for added strength. Her bow was heavily reinforced with extra plating and internal bracing. Her engines produced enough power to push through light-pack ice. She wasn't beautiful. Cargo steamers rarely are. Her lines were practical rather than elegant. Her superstructure, the above-deck buildings housing crew quarters, bridge, and equipment, was blocky and functional. She had 2 masts for emergency sail power, though her steam engines were her primary propulsion. Everything about her design prioritized strength and functionality over aesthetics. The Hudson's Bay Company purchased her immediately upon completion and put her to work on what was called the Arctic supply route. Every summer, she would leave Vancouver, loaded with supplies, food, tools, clothing, fuel, manufactured goods. She would sail north along the western coast of Canada, past the Alaskan Panhandle, through the Aleutian Islands, and into the Bering Sea. The Bering Strait, the narrow passage between Alaska and Siberia, was her gateway to the Arctic Ocean. This 60-mile wide strait connects the Pacific Ocean to the Arctic Ocean. It's shallow, which means ice can block it even when adjacent waters are clear. Strong currents make navigation treacherous. Weather changes rapidly and dramatically. Many ships have come to grief in the Bering Strait. Once through the strait, the Baychimo would turn east, following the northern coast of Alaska and Canada. This route took her into the Beaufort Sea, one of the most ice-prone bodies of water on Earth. Even in summer, when ice coverage is at its minimum, pack ice remained close. The ship would navigate carefully between ice floes, sometimes waiting days for ice to shift and open passages. Her destination was a series of Hudson's Bay Company trading posts, scattered along the coast, small settlements, where company factors managed trade with local Inuit communities. The Baychimo would stop at each post, unload supplies, and load furs. The entire journey from Vancouver to the furthest trading post and back covered over 5,000 miles through some of the world's most dangerous waters. The window for this journey was incredibly narrow. The Arctic ice begins retreating in June. By August, it starts advancing again. This gave ships perhaps 10 weeks to complete their voyages. Any delay, mechanical problems, bad weather, poor ice conditions could mean being trapped when winter ice closed in. Despite these dangers, the Baychimo made the journey successfully 9 times. From 1922 through 1930, she completed her Arctic supply run every summer without serious incident. Her various captains became expert at reading ice conditions, consulting with Inuit guides about local conditions, and knowing when to advance and when to retreat. But the Arctic is not forgiving. Experience helps, but it doesn't guarantee safety. The best captains, the strongest ships, the most careful planning, all can be undone by bad luck, poor timing, or weather that simply refuses to cooperate. In 1931, the Baychimo's luck ran out. Consider what the year 1931 meant globally. The Great Depression was deepening. Stock markets had crashed 2 years earlier. Unemployment was rising worldwide. Banks were failing. Yet luxury goods like furs still commanded high prices because the wealthy remained wealthy even in depression. The fur trade continued, not despite economic hardship, but partly because of it. Furs represented status and wealth that seemed proof against economic turmoil. The Baychimo's final voyage began in July 1931 under the command of Captain John Cornwell. He was an experienced Arctic navigator who had made the run numerous times before. His crew numbered 36 men, engineers, deckhands, officers, all experienced in Arctic operations. They knew what they were facing. But from the beginning, conditions were wrong. Weather reports indicated unusually cold spring temperatures. The winter ice hadn't retreated as far as normal. Meteorologists noted that 1931 would likely be a difficult year for Arctic navigation. The Hudson's Bay Company considered postponing the voyage but ultimately decided to proceed. The trading posts needed supplies, and the pelts waiting at those posts represented too much money to leave sitting. The Baychimo left Vancouver in mid-July, slightly later than usual due to mechanical work that delayed departure. This late start meant less margin for error. Captain Cornwell knew this, but once the voyage was approved, his job was to make it succeed. The journey north was slower than normal. Ice lingered in passages that were usually clear by July. The Baychimo had to wait repeatedly for ice to shift, losing precious days. By the time she reached the Bering Strait in early August, they were already behind schedule. Once through the strait and into the Beaufort Sea, conditions improved temporarily. The Baychimo made good progress along the coast, stopping at trading posts to deliver supplies and load furs. By mid-September, she had completed most of her route and was heading back south. Her cargo holds were full of valuable pelts. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, albeit delayed. But September in the Arctic is a dangerous time. The sun drops lower each day, temperatures fall rapidly, the water begins to freeze, ice that melted over summer starts to reform. Each day, the window for escape narrows. Captain Cornwell watched the ice charts carefully. Reports from other ships indicated ice was forming faster than usual. The cold spring had turned into a cold early autumn. He pushed the Baychimo as fast as safety allowed, trying to reach the Bering Strait before the ice closed in. On October 1st, 1931, near Point Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost point of the United States, the Baychimo became trapped. Point Barrow deserves special attention. It's the northernmost point of the United States, jutting into the Arctic Ocean like a finger pointing toward the pole. The waters here are particularly treacherous because currents from two directions meet and create unpredictable ice movements. What might be open water in the morning can be solid pack ice by afternoon. Ships approaching Point Barrow must watch conditions constantly and be prepared to retreat at any sign of ice closing in. It happened during the night. The crew went to sleep with open water around them. They woke to find themselves surrounded by ice. During the dark hours, pack ice had drifted in from the north, pushed by wind and current. By morning, the ice was everywhere, thick sheets of it, pressing against the hull, grinding together with sounds like distant thunder. Captain Cornwell immediately assessed the situation. The ship was trapped, but not in immediate danger. The ice pressure wasn't strong enough to damage the hull yet. His options were limited. They could wait and hope the ice would shift and release them. Or they could abandon ship and try to reach safety on foot. Neither option was appealing. Waiting meant gambling that conditions would improve. But it was already October. Winter was coming. Every day that passed made escape less likely and survival more difficult. If the ship remained trapped through winter, the crew would face months in one of the harshest environments on Earth, with limited supplies and no possibility of rescue until spring. Abandoning ship meant leaving behind not just the vessel, but the valuable cargo. The Hudson's Bay Company had invested significant money in this voyage. Walking out over ice to the nearest settlement was also dangerous. The ice could shift and break. Storms could strike. Men could get lost, freeze, or fall through thin ice. Cornwell decided to wait. Experience suggested that ice conditions often changed. A storm could break up the pack ice. A current shift could open a lead. He sent radio messages to the Hudson's Bay Company reporting the situation. They agreed with his decision to wait, at least initially. Days passed. The ice didn't open. Instead, it got thicker. New ice formed between existing floes, binding everything together in a solid mass. The temperature dropped steadily. By mid-October, it was reaching -20°C at night. The ship's heating systems worked continuously just to keep the interior habitable. On October 15th, 2 weeks after becoming trapped, the Hudson's Bay Company made a decision. They sent another ship, the Northland, to rescue the Baychimo's crew. The Northland was specifically designed for ice operations and managed to reach the trapped vessel by carefully threading through ice channels. The Northland's captain recommended immediate evacuation. His ship could take all the crew south to safety. The Baychimo would have to be abandoned, but men's lives were more valuable than cargo or ship. Captain Cornwell agreed to partial evacuation. 22 men, mostly the younger, less experienced crew members, transferred to the Northland. But Cornwell and 14 others remained aboard the Baychimo. Why? Several reasons. First, pride. Captains don't easily abandon their ships. Second, responsibility. The Baychimo and her cargo represented substantial investment. If there was any chance of saving her, it was worth trying. Third, experience. Cornwell and his skeleton crew had all been through Arctic winters before. They knew how to survive. And fourth, stubbornness. The belief that giving up was premature, that conditions might still improve. The Northland departed with her load of evacuees, promising to return if the situation became critical. The 15 men remaining on the Baychimo settled in for a long wait. They built a shelter on the ice beside the ship, a wooden structure framed with timber from the Baychimo's cargo hold, insulated with canvas and furs, heated by a stove. This shelter would serve as emergency refuge if the ship became unsafe. They stockpiled supplies, food, fuel, tools, cold weather gear. They established watch schedules to monitor ice conditions constantly. October turned into November. The sun disappeared below the horizon for longer each day. By mid-November, They were experiencing extended periods of darkness. The temperature dropped below -30. The ice pressure on the hull increased. The ship began listing slightly as ice built up more on one side than the other. Captain Cornwell kept meticulous logs. His entries from this period are brief and professional, showing strain but not panic. November 1st, ice holding. No change. November 7th, pressure increasing. Ship listing 2 degrees. November 15th, temperature -32. Supplies adequate. Morale good. But beneath the professional tone, everyone knew they were in serious danger. If the ice crushed the ship, they would be stranded on foot in the Arctic winter. The shelter would keep them alive temporarily, but they couldn't survive months in a wooden hut on shifting ice. They needed either the ice to break up or a rescue mission. Neither seemed likely before spring. Then, on November 24th, the weather changed. A storm was coming. Arctic storms are not like storms in temperate regions. They don't build gradually, giving warning. They strike suddenly and with overwhelming force. The temperature drops. The wind rises from 0 to hurricane force in minutes. Snow falls so thick that visibility drops to 0. Sound disappears into the howling wind. On November 24th, 1931, 1 month after the Northland's evacuation, such a storm struck the Baychimo. The watchkeeper noticed the change first. The wind picked up from the north, and the temperature began dropping rapidly. Within an hour, snow was falling. Within 2 hours, it was a full blizzard. The watchkeeper alerted Captain Cornwell, who immediately ordered all hands to the ice shelter. The Baychimo was only yards away, but in whiteout conditions, even short distances become treacherous. The men formed a human chain, each holding onto the next, and moved carefully from the ship to the shelter. Inside, they sealed the door and windows, stoked the stove, and waited. The wind howled with a sound like a living thing. The walls of the shelter creaked and groaned. Snow piled up against the structure, eventually covering it completely. The men inside huddled around the stove, taking turns keeping it fed with fuel. Outside, the storm raged. They couldn't check on the ship. Opening the door meant instant danger from wind and cold. Venturing outside meant getting lost in seconds. They could only wait and hope the shelter held and the storm passed. The blizzard lasted 3 days. 3 days of constant wind and snow. 3 days of darkness, broken only by the light from the stove. 3 days of uncertainty about whether the ship was surviving the storm, whether the ice was breaking up, whether they would live to see the storm end. 3 days doesn't sound long. In normal conditions, 3 days is barely noticeable, but 3 days in an Arctic blizzard is eternity. The men in that shelter couldn't see the ship yards away. They couldn't check conditions. They couldn't know if the ice was breaking up, if the ship was being crushed, if they were drifting away from her. They could only wait in darkness, broken only by the stove's glow, listening to wind that sounded like the end of the world, wondering if they'd survive to see the storm end. On November 27th, the wind finally died. The snow stopped. The men carefully opened the shelter door and dug their way out through the snowdrift that had buried them. They looked toward where the Baychimo had been. The ship was gone, not sunk, not crushed and broken, simply gone. Where there had been a 230-foot steel vessel 2 days ago, there was now only ice fields stretching in all directions. The storm had broken up the pack ice, and the Baychimo had drifted away into the darkness and snow. For a moment, the men stood in silence, processing what this meant. They were stranded on Arctic ice in late November, with winter fully established. The nearest settlement was miles away across broken, shifting ice. They had limited supplies, only what they'd brought to the shelter. The ship, with all her resources, was gone. Captain Cornwell gathered his men and explained the situation calmly. They had no choice. They would have to walk out. The nearest known Inuit settlement was about 40 miles south. In good conditions, this would be a 2 or 3 day journey. But these weren't good conditions. The ice was broken and unstable. The weather could turn deadly at any moment. Men could fall through thin ice. They could get lost. They could freeze. But staying wasn't an option. The shelter couldn't sustain 15 men through an Arctic winter. They had perhaps a week's worth of food. Fuel for the stove would last longer, but not months. And even if they somehow survived the winter, spring breakup would destroy the shelter and leave them stranded on drifting ice floes. They prepared carefully. Each man took the warmest clothing available. They packed food, a basic tent, fuel, and emergency supplies in improvised sleds. They oriented themselves using compass and stars, and then they started walking. The journey was nightmare. The broken ice created a landscape of pressure ridges, open leads, and unstable flows. Sometimes they had to backtrack miles to find safe crossing points. The temperature stayed below -30. Exposed skin froze in minutes. Several men developed frostbite despite all precautions. They walked during daylight what little there was and camped at night in the tent, huddled together for warmth. Progress was measured in miles per day, sometimes only a few miles when ice conditions were particularly bad. But they kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death. On the fourth day, they spotted smoke on the horizon, an Inuit settlement. Relief turned to joy as they stumbled into the village. The Inuit residents, accustomed to emergency situations in the Arctic, immediately provided shelter, food, and medical attention for the frostbitten men. Radio messages were sent. The Hudson's Bay Company arranged rescue. Eventually, all 15 men made it safely back to civilization. Several suffered permanent damage from frostbite, lost fingers or toes, but they were alive. They had survived abandonment, a blizzard, and a deadly walk across Arctic ice. The Baychimo, everyone assumed, was finished. The storm that had broken up the ice would have destroyed her, or at least damaged her enough that she'd sink quickly. Arctic ice doesn't let ships escape intact. The assumption was that she'd gone down somewhere in the Beaufort Sea, joining countless other vessels claimed by the Arctic. That assumption was wrong. 9 days after the blizzard, December 6, 1931, an Inuit seal hunter was traveling across pack ice about 50 miles from Point Barrow. He spotted something unusual on the horizon, a large, dark shape embedded in the ice. At first, he thought it might be a whale carcass or perhaps a rock formation, but as he approached, he realized it was a ship. He returned to his settlement and reported the sighting. Word reached the Hudson's Bay Company through their trading post network. Could it be the Baychimo? The location was wrong. The ship had drifted substantial distance from where she'd been trapped, but there were no other large vessels unaccounted for in that region. A search party set out, including Captain Cornwell and several of his former crew. It took days to reach the location across broken ice. But when they arrived, there she was, the Baychimo, trapped in ice but intact, battered by the storm, covered in snow and ice but afloat. Against all reasonable expectation, she had survived. Cornwell's reaction was mixed. Relief that his ship hadn't sunk, frustration that he couldn't reach her or board her safely. The ice around the Baychimo was too unstable. Large cracks ran through it. Trying to approach across the ice would be suicidal. Men could fall through at any moment. Trying to cut through the ice to free her would take equipment they didn't have. Cornwell radioed the Hudson's Bay Company with his assessment. The ship was intact but inaccessible. Salvage would require specialized equipment and much better ice conditions. The company considered their options. Winter had fully set in. Any salvage operation would have to wait until spring at the earliest. By then, the ship might have drifted again or finally sunk. They decided to salvage what they could. Over several dangerous days in mid-December, working in temperatures below -30, Cornwell and a small crew managed to access some external storage compartments. They extracted valuable furs that weren't in the main cargo holds. It was dangerous, difficult work, men, working on unstable ice beside a ship that could shift or the ice could break at any moment. They salvaged what they could and then made the decision. The Baychimo would be officially abandoned. She was deemed not worth the risk of men's lives to attempt full recovery. The Hudson's Bay Company filed the appropriate paperwork. The ship was abandoned, her ownership relinquished, her fate left to the Arctic. No one expected her to last the winter. Arctic ice regularly crushes ships with far stronger hulls than the Baychimo's. By spring, everyone assumed she would be on the ocean floor. In March 1932, 4 months after abandonment, a trading ship captain named Ronald Coates was navigating near Wainwright, Alaska, about 200 miles from where the Baychimo had last been seen. Through breaks in the fog, he spotted a derelict vessel drifting in pack ice. Curious, he maneuvered closer and was shocked to read the name painted on the hull, Baychimo. Coates immediately radioed his report. The Hudson's Bay Company was stunned. The ship they'd written off, the ship that should have been crushed months ago, was not only still afloat, but had drifted 200 miles. They immediately organized a salvage expedition. If the ship had survived this long, maybe she could still be recovered. The cargo was mostly gone, but the vessel herself had value. But by the time the salvage crew reached Wainwright, the Baychimo had moved again. Days of searching found nothing. The ice had shifted, carrying the derelict elsewhere. Eventually, the salvage crew gave up and returned south. The Baychimo had escaped. This would become a pattern that repeated for decades. Sighting, salvage, attempt, escape. The Baychimo played an involuntary game of cat and mouse with those trying to catch her. The cat never won. In July 1932, during the brief summer melt, Inuit hunters near Point Barrow spotted the Baychimo floating free in open water. They tried to approach in their small boats, but couldn't get close enough to board safely. The ship appeared to be in relatively good condition, listing slightly, but otherwise intact. By the next day, currents had carried her out of sight. In November 1932, exactly 1 year after her abandonment, a prospector named Leslie Melvin encountered the Baychimo while traveling by dog sled. She was frozen in pack ice, about 60 miles inland from the coast. Melvin was astonished to find a major vessel this far from open water, but Arctic ice movements are unpredictable. She must have been carried by ice flow during the summer. Melvin actually managed to board her, the first person to set foot on the Baychimo since her abandonment. His account, recorded years later, provides fascinating details. The ship was frozen solid, every surface coated with ice. The cargo holds were largely empty where salvage crews had worked, but other areas remained untouched. In the crew quarters, personal belongings remained: books frozen in bunks, photographs pinned to walls, clothes in lockers. The galley still had dishes in cabinets and pots on the stove, all frozen in place. The captain's cabin showed signs of hasty departure papers scattered, a coat hanging on a chair. It was like a time capsule, preserving the moment when the crew evacuated during the blizzard. The engine room was heavily damaged by ice. Machinery that should have been maintained had frozen and contracted, causing metal to crack. The boiler showed signs of pressure damage. It was clear the ship would never sail under her own power again, but structurally, she was sound. The hull showed no major breaches. The basic framework remained intact. Melvin took some items as souvenirs and proof of his visit: a logbook, some navigation instruments, personal effects. He then left, marking the ship's location carefully on his maps. He reported the sighting when he reached civilization, noting exact coordinates. Yet another salvage expedition was organized. And once again, by the time salvagers reached the reported location, the Baychimo was gone. The ice had broken up during an early spring thaw, and she drifted away again. The sightings continued through 1933, 34, and 35. Each year brought multiple reports. Hunters spotted her, Ships encountered her, prospectors stumbled across her, and each time, by the time anyone could mount a serious salvage attempt, she had moved. The pattern became almost comical. A report would come in. The Hudson's Bay Company or private salvagers would organize a crew. They'd travel to the reported location. The Baychimo would be gone. They'd search the surrounding area. Sometimes they'd find signs that she'd been there, displaced ice, marks in the snow. But the ship herself had vanished. The Arctic was too vast, the ice too mobile, communications too slow. By the time a sighting was reported and confirmed, and a salvage crew assembled and transported and arrived at the location, weeks or months had passed. The Baychimo could drift hundreds of miles in that time, pushed by currents and ice movements. She earned her nickname during these years, the Ghost Ship. Not because of anything supernatural, but because she appeared and disappeared like a spectre. You'd hear reports of her somewhere. You'd go there. She'd be gone. She haunted the Arctic not through any mystical means, but through the simple reality of ice drift and poor timing. As years passed and sightings accumulated, the Baychimo developed a reputation that extended beyond simple maritime curiosity. She became a legend. Sailors told stories about her in ports from Alaska to Greenland. Some stories were true, documented in ship logs and official reports. Others were exaggerations, embellishments that grew with each retelling. And some were complete fabrications, invented by storytellers who'd never seen the ship but knew a good tale. But beneath the legends and exaggerations lay a remarkable truth. A large steel ship really was drifting through the Arctic, really was appearing and disappearing, really was evading all attempts at recovery. This wasn't a ghost story. It was documented fact. The phenomenon of ghost ships is not new to maritime history. Derelict vessels have been found drifting since humans first built boats. The Mary Celeste, discovered in 1872 floating, abandoned and intact, remains the most famous example. But the Baychimo was different. The Mary Celeste was found once, towed to port, and her mystery was centered on why her crew abandoned her. The Baychimo was found dozens of times over nearly 4 decades, and her mystery was why she wouldn't stay put or sink. So why couldn't anyone catch her? Why did every salvage attempt fail? The answer lies in understanding Arctic ice dynamics. Pack ice is not static. It's in constant motion, driven by ocean currents, pushed by wind, expanding and contracting with temperature changes. A ship frozen in pack ice becomes part of this motion. When the ice moves, the ship moves with it. When ice breaks up in summer, the ship floats free and drifts with currents. When winter returns, she freezes in at her new location. The Beaufort Sea, where the Baychimo spent most of her drifting years, has a dominant circular current pattern called the Beaufort Gyre. This current moves clockwise, completing one full rotation roughly every 10 years. A ship caught in this gyre would drift in a vast circle, passing the same general regions repeatedly, but never staying in exactly the same place. The Baychimo's sighting records, when plotted on a map, show exactly this pattern. She'd appear near Point Barrow one year, drift north toward the permanent ice pack, swing west toward Siberia, then south toward Alaska's north coast, then east again toward Canada. The cycle would repeat, with variations caused by wind conditions and seasonal ice movements. This meant she was genuinely unpredictable. A sighting in one location didn't help predict where she'd be next month or next year. Ice conditions, storm patterns, current variations, all influenced her path. She was following natural forces, not any course that humans could predict or intercept. Communication difficulties made the problem worse. In the 1930s and 40s, radio communication in the Arctic was primitive and unreliable. Many small settlements had no radio equipment at all. Hunters and prospectors who spotted the Baychimo often couldn't report it immediately. They'd have to travel to a settlement with radio capability. Messages would be relayed through multiple stations. Days or weeks would pass before word reached anyone who could organize a salvage attempt. By that time, the information was hopelessly outdated. The The Baychimo could drift 50 or 100 miles in a week when currents were strong. A report that was accurate when sent was useless by the time it was received and acted upon. Weather also played a significant role. Arctic weather is notoriously unstable. A clear day can turn into a blizzard in hours. Fog banks roll in suddenly, reducing visibility to zero. Even when salvagers reached approximately the right location, finding one ship in thousands of square miles of ice and water was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Except the haystack was constantly rearranging itself, and the needle could move at any time. And then there was the question of whether catching her was worth the effort. By the mid-1930s, the Baychimo had been empty for years. The valuable cargo of furs had long since been salvaged. Her engines were damaged beyond repair. Even if someone managed to reach her and board her and somehow tow her through Arctic ice to open water and then to a port with repair facilities, what then? The cost of all that would far exceed the ship's value. She was, in practical terms, worthless. Salvagers might recover some scrap metal, but not enough to justify the enormous cost and danger of Arctic salvage operations. Insurance companies had already paid out on her loss. The Hudson's Bay Company had written her off completely. Private salvagers occasionally attempted recovery, motivated more by challenge and fame than profit, but all failed. So the Baychimo continued her drift. She became a navigational hazard. Ships were warned to watch for her. She appeared on charts marked as a drifting derelict. Reports of sightings were recorded and filed, but rarely acted upon. She became part of Arctic lore, a known mystery that everyone had heard of, but no one could solve. Scientists became interested in her as a natural experiment in ship survival. How long could a steel vessel last in Arctic conditions without any maintenance? The Baychimo was providing an answer, longer than anyone expected. Each year she remained afloat, contradicted predictions about ship degradation. Naval architects studied reports of her condition, trying to understand what made her so durable. Several factors contributed to her survival. First, her construction. Built specifically for ice navigation, she had a reinforced double hull that proved remarkably tough. The Hudson's Bay Company had invested in quality when they commissioned her, and that quality was paying dividends even in abandonment. Second, her drifting pattern. She spent much time frozen in ice, which ironically protected her. When ice surrounded the hull, it supported and cushioned the ship, distributing pressure forces that might otherwise damage the structure. The ice that trapped her also preserved her. Third, pure luck. She never encountered the truly catastrophic conditions that crush most abandoned ships. She never got caught in an ice jam where pressure becomes so great that steel buckles and fails. She never grounded on rocks during summer drift. She never flipped in a storm. All these things could have destroyed her, and all are common in Arctic waters. But somehow, they never happened to the Baychimo. Or perhaps they did happen multiple times, and she survived them. We only know about the successful sightings, the times when she was spotted intact. We don't know about close calls, near disasters, conditions that almost destroyed her but didn't quite. The Arctic could have tested her limits dozens of times, and each time, by chance or engineering or some combination, she passed the test. By the late 1930s, the Baychimo had been drifting for nearly a decade. She'd been sighted by dozens of different people. She'd appeared in ship logs from multiple nations: American, Canadian, Soviet. She'd been photographed. She'd been boarded. Her continued existence was undeniable, and yet no one could catch her. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 changed the Arctic dramatically. What had been a remote backwater crossed only by fur traders and occasional explorers suddenly became strategically important. The war made the Arctic matter in ways it never had before. The Lend-Lease program, through which America supplied the Soviet Union with war materials, established northern sea routes as critical supply lines. Ships that would never normally venture into Arctic waters were pressed into service carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supplies to Soviet ports. These ships needed protection from German submarines and surface raiders, so naval vessels patrolled waters that had rarely seen warships. Military aircraft flew regular reconnaissance missions over the Arctic, watching for enemy activity and gathering weather data, essential for bombing missions over Europe. Weather stations were established at remote locations, staffed by military personnel who monitored conditions and radioed reports. The Arctic, previously inhabited mainly by indigenous communities and a few traders, suddenly had a significant military presence. All this activity meant more eyes scanning Arctic waters, more ships, more aircraft, more people who might spot a drifting derelict. And indeed, Baychimo sightings continued, now often reported by military personnel rather than fur traders or hunters. In 1940, a Soviet icebreaker encountered the Baychimo near the New Siberian Islands, a remote Arctic archipelago north of Siberia. The icebreaker was escorting a convoy of cargo ships carrying supplies to Soviet forces. The captain, spotting a derelict in the ice, decided to investigate. His crew managed to board the Baychimo and spent several hours exploring. Their photographs, preserved in Soviet naval archives, show the ship in remarkable condition despite 9 years of drift. Ice coating covers everything. The superstructure shows signs of damaged bent railings, collapsed sections, but the hull remains fundamentally sound. The photographs show crew members standing on the ice-covered deck, examining the frozen bridge, looking into empty cargo holds. The Soviet captain considered towing the derelict to port. His icebreaker was certainly powerful enough, but several factors argued against it. First, the war effort required his ship elsewhere. Escorting valuable cargo took priority over salvaging an abandoned wreck. Second, the Baychimo's condition made towing dangerous. Her damaged superstructure could collapse during a tow. Her frozen, possibly damaged rudder could make her unstable. Third, ownership was unclear. The ship had been officially abandoned, but salvage law was complicated, and the Soviet Union didn't want legal complications with Britain or Canada over a worthless hulk. So they photographed her, took some items as souvenirs, and left her where she was. The Baychimo continued her drift. In 1942, an American military aircraft on a reconnaissance flight photographed a derelict ship frozen in pack ice north of Alaska. The aircrew noted it in their mission log but didn't investigate. Their orders were to watch for enemy vessels and report weather conditions, not explore abandoned ships. The photographs were filed in military archives and forgotten for decades. Much later, researchers examining wartime records identified the vessel in the photographs as almost certainly the Baychimo, based on size, location, and configuration. In 1943, the USS Sachem, a small patrol vessel working the Alaskan coast, nearly collided with a drifting derelict in heavy fog near Point Hope. The watch officer spotted the dark shape emerging from the mist just in time to order a course change. As they passed close aboard, they could read enough of the name on the hull to identify her. Baychimo. The Sachem's captain considered investigating but decided against it. The fog was thick and dangerous. His mission was patrol, not salvage. And the derelict, though intact enough to float, looked battered and unstable. Better to mark the position and report it than to risk collision or boarding accident in these conditions. By the time the fog cleared, the Baychimo had drifted out of sight. These wartime sightings followed the established pattern. The ship was spotted, her position was noted, and she disappeared before anyone could act on the information. But the wartime reports had a different quality than earlier sightings. Military personnel kept better records. Their reports included precise times, positions, conditions. They took photographs where possible. They provided detailed descriptions in official logs. These reports, accumulated over the war years, provided the most comprehensive documentation yet of the Baychimo's condition and movements. Researchers analyzing them later could trace her drift pattern with some accuracy. They could see how damage accumulated over time, rigging gone, superstructure progressively collapsing, rust spreading. But they could also see that the fundamental structure remained sound. The hull integrity persisted. The ship still floated. During 1944, 1945, and 1946, additional sightings came from various military sources. A weather station reported spotting her through binoculars. An aircraft photographed her from altitude. A ship encountered her in a particularly narrow ice channel and had to maneuver carefully to avoid collision. Each sighting confirmed the impossible. The Baychimo was still out there. 15 years after abandonment. 15 Arctic winters. 15 cycles of freezing and thawing, ice pressure and storm damage, rust and metal fatigue. Any rational prediction said she should have been destroyed years ago. Naval architects couldn't explain it. Marine insurance experts were baffled. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Photographs, ship logs, multiple independent reports all confirmed the same thing. The war ended in 1945. Military presence in the Arctic decreased but didn't disappear. The Cold War was beginning, and the Arctic remained strategically important. This meant continued traffic, continued surveillance, and continued Baychimo sightings. The Cold War brought new intensity to Arctic operations. The United States and Soviet Union faced each other across the Arctic Ocean. Both sides built early warning radar stations to detect bomber attacks. Both conducted military exercises in Arctic conditions. Both maintained year-round bases that had previously been impossible. The distant early warning line, the DEW line, stretched across the North American Arctic from Alaska to Greenland. Dozens of radar stations, each staffed by military personnel, watched the skies for Soviet bombers. These stations also watched the ice, the weather, and anything unusual, including drifting ships. Commercial interest in the Arctic also increased. Oil companies began exploration operations. Mining companies examined northern mineral deposits. Scientific research stations were established. All this meant more people, more equipment, more reasons to be in the Arctic, and more chances to encounter the Baychimo. In 1947, a group of Inuit hunters found the Baychimo frozen solid in pack ice near Icy Cape, Alaska. They spent an entire day exploring her, the most extensive civilian boarding since Leslie Melvin's visit 15 years earlier. Their accounts describe a ship transformed by time and ice. 16 years of Arctic conditions had taken a visible toll. The hunters entered through a damaged section of hull where ice pressure had bent plates outward. Inside, everything was frozen. They walked through crew quarters where bunks still held blankets frozen solid, covered in frost. The galley was a frozen tableau of abandoned meal preparation. The bridge equipment was encased in ice. They found the captain's cabin, documents scattered and frozen, a calendar still showing November 1931. But despite obvious damage, the structure remained fundamentally intact. The hull wasn't breached below the waterline. The internal bulkheads still stood. The ship's bones were solid. The hunters took some items, tools, personal effects, and reported their discovery. As with every previous sighting, by the time authorities could organize to investigate, the Baychimo had moved. In 1952, a Canadian military aircraft on a routine patrol spotted the Baychimo floating free in open water during the brief summer melt. They circled her multiple times, taking photographs from various angles. The photographs show a vessel that's clearly struggling but still afloat. Her decks are awash. She's listing heavily. Ice damage has collapsed much of the superstructure. But she floats. The photographs from 1952 became some of the most widely distributed images of the Baychimo. They appeared in newspapers and magazines. They were used in maritime safety discussions. They became part of the ship's legend, visual proof that she really existed, really survived, really defied expectations. In 1955, a Soviet fishing trawler captain named Mikhail Gusakov encountered the derelict while working waters north of Siberia. Gusakov's account, published years later in a Soviet maritime journal after the Cold War ended, provides a Russian perspective on the famous ghost ship. Gusakov tried to board her. He maneuvered his trawler close and threw grappling lines, but ice conditions made close approach too dangerous. The ice was broken into small floes that moved independently. His trawler could easily be trapped between floes or pushed into collision with the derelict. After several attempts, he gave up and watched the Baychimo drift away into fog. But before she disappeared, Gusakov observed her carefully. He noted that she rode very low in the water, certainly taking on water below decks. Her list had become severe at least 15 degrees. Portions of her hull showed visible damage. It was clear to him that she couldn't survive much longer. His assessment: 6 months, maybe a year at most. Gusakov's prediction, like so many before it, was wrong. In 1956, 25 years after her abandonment, the Baychimo made perhaps her most famous appearance. A group of American oil prospectors working the north coast of Alaska spotted her grounded on a shallow reef. This was extraordinary because it meant she was actually accessible. The ice had retreated enough that the reef was exposed. At low tide, it was possible to walk from shore to the ship. The prospectors spent days exploring her. This is the most detailed account we have of the Baychimo's late-stage condition. They documented everything, took photographs, made measurements, and kept notes. Their description paints a picture of a ship at the absolute edge of survival. The superstructure was largely gone, collapsed, or torn away by ice and storms. The bridge existed only as broken remnants. The masts were gone entirely. The deck had multiple holes where rust had eaten through steel. Below deck, conditions were even worse. Water sloshed in the lower compartments. She was clearly taking on water. Though slowly, the engine room was a disaster of corroded, ice-damaged machinery. The cargo holds were empty shells, rusted and deteriorating. But the hull, the basic structure, remained. Damaged? Yes. Deteriorating? Absolutely. But intact enough to stay afloat. The double plating that had made her strong when new was still doing its job quarter-century later. The prospectors discussed salvage. They contacted the Hudson's Bay Company about ownership rights. The company response was simple: she's yours if you can recover her. But recovery wasn't simple. The ship weighed over 1,000 tons. Even in her deteriorated state, moving her would require tugboats, specialized equipment, calm weather, and perfect timing. The cost would be enormous. The value would be minimal, some scrap metal, historical curiosity, nothing more. While the prospectors debated options, tides and ice made the decision for them. A storm pushed ice into the reef area. The Baychimo lifted on the rising tide, broke free from the reef, and drifted away. Within days, she was gone. The prospectors never saw her again. This scene near recovery, followed by escape, epitomizes the Baychimo story. So close, close enough to touch, to board, to measure and document, but never close enough to capture. The Arctic always kept her just beyond human reach. As the 1960s began, Baychimo sightings became noticeably less frequent. The ship had been drifting for 3 decades. Even the most durable vessel has limits. The cumulative damage from ice pressure, storms, rust, metal fatigue, and simple time was finally overwhelming her remarkable endurance. The reports that did come in described a ship in obviously deteriorating condition. This was inevitable. Steel corrodes. Salt water accelerates the process. Ice damage creates stress fractures that propagate and expand. Without maintenance, without pumps to remove water, without protective coatings, without repairs, deterioration accelerates exponentially. In 1962, an Inuit whaling crew spotted her near Point Barrow. Their description was alarming. Barely floating, listing badly, nearly swamped. This was the first report suggesting the Baychimo might finally be failing. For 30 years, reports had described her as damaged but fundamentally intact. Now, for the first time, witnesses said she looked ready to sink. The whaling crew didn't approach closely. The ship looked unstable. Heavy seas could swamp her completely. Getting near such a vessel was dangerous. If she rolled or sank suddenly, anyone nearby could be caught in the suction. They observed from a safe distance and then moved on. When they reported the sighting weeks later, search attempts found nothing. In 1964, a Soviet research vessel photographed what crew members believed to be the Baychimo from several miles distant. The photographs are grainy and inconclusive. The vessel is clearly a derelict, clearly in distress, but positive identification is impossible at that distance. Ice conditions prevented closer approach. The research vessel had scientific missions to complete and couldn't dedicate time to investigating a derelict. They noted the position and continued their work. Later analysis of these photographs suggests the vessel was indeed the Baychimo. The size matches. The configuration, despite heavy damage, is consistent, and the location fits known drift patterns. But without closer examination, certainty is impossible. This ambiguity itself is telling. By the 1960s, the Baychimo had deteriorated to the point where even identifying her was becoming difficult. Then came 1969, 38 years after abandonment. A group of Inuit hunters traveling near Point Barrow, not far from where the Baychimo had first become trapped in 1931, spotted a large derelict frozen in pack ice. They recognized her immediately, despite the damage. The Baychimo was back near her starting point, having completed decades of circular drift. Point Barrow deserves special attention. It's the northernmost point of the United States, jutting into the Arctic Ocean like a finger pointing toward the pole. The waters here are particularly treacherous because currents from two directions meet and create unpredictable ice movements. What might be open water in the morning can be solid pack ice by afternoon. Ships approaching Point Barrow must watch conditions constantly and be prepared to retreat at any sign of ice closing in. The hunters approached cautiously. The ship was in terrible condition. The superstructure had collapsed completely. The hull showed enormous holes where ice pressure had finally breached the steel plating. She was listing at a severe angle, at least 30 degrees. Water was clearly inside, probably flooding multiple compartments. She looked ready to sink at any moment. The hunters didn't board. The ice conditions were too dangerous, and the ship looked ready to roll over. They observed from a safe distance, took mental note of details to report later, and continued their hunt. When they reached their settlement days later, they reported what they'd seen. By the time authorities could investigate weeks later due to weather and logistics, the Baychimo was gone. Not just moved, gone completely. Searches of the area found nothing. Aerial surveys found nothing. She had vanished. This is where the story ends, or rather, where it stops, because calling it an ending would imply resolution. There is no resolution. The Baychimo simply disappeared from history, as mysteriously as she'd persisted through it. Did she finally sink? Almost certainly. The condition reported by the hunters, heavily flooded, severely damaged, barely afloat, suggests a ship in her final hours. A storm could have finished her. Continued flooding could have pulled her down. Ice pressure could have completed the breaching of her hull. Any of these things would have sent her to the bottom. But we don't know this for certain. We don't know where, or when, or under what circumstances. The Arctic is vast and deep. The Beaufort Sea averages over 1,000 feet deep, with some areas reaching 3,000 feet. A sunken ship could rest on the bottom indefinitely, perfectly preserved by the cold, never found unless someone specifically searches the right location with appropriate equipment. The Baychimo could lie there now, her steel hull slowly corroding in the cold salt water, her empty compartments becoming home to Arctic fish species, her rusting superstructure providing shelter for marine life. In the lightless deep, in near-freezing water, deterioration happened slowly. She could remain recognizable for centuries. Or she could have been completely destroyed. Ice pressure can pulverize ships, reducing them to scattered debris spread across miles of ocean floor. If the final crushing was catastrophic enough, the Baychimo might exist only as fragments, pieces of steel, machinery, and memory scattered in the deep. Or, and this is the possibility that captures imagination most strongly, she could still be drifting. Not on the surface where she can be seen, but beneath it. Ships can achieve what's called neutral buoyancy. Waterlogged, but with enough trapped air to prevent sinking, a vessel can float suspended in the water column, neither on the surface nor on the bottom, but drifting in the deep water, invisible, following currents, a ghost ship in the most literal sense. It's unlikely. Ships at neutral buoyancy usually drift until they encounter conditions that destroy that balance, a current that pushes them deeper, a pressure change that compresses trapped air, a structural failure that lets remaining air escape. But unlikely isn't impossible. The Baychimo survived countless unlikely circumstances. Why not one more? The last confirmed sighting was 1969, but there have been unconfirmed reports since. A fisherman in the 1970s claimed to spot a derelict that could have been the Baychimo. A pilot in the 1980s reported seeing what might have been her from altitude. None of these reports were confirmed. All could be mistakes, other wrecks, or simple misidentifications. But they fuel the possibility, the hope, really, that somewhere in Arctic waters, the ghost ship still exists, still drifts, still evades discovery. The Baychimo's disappearance in 1969 didn't end interest in her fate. If anything, it intensified. A ship that had captured public imagination for nearly 4 decades couldn't simply vanish without generating curiosity about what happened to her. As technology improved and Arctic access increased, serious efforts began to locate the wreck. In 2007, the Alaska government launched an ambitious project to locate and document historic shipwrecks in Alaskan waters. The Baychimo was high on their list, not just because of her fame, but because a large steel wreck somewhere in heavily trafficked Arctic waters represented a genuine navigation hazard. As Arctic ice diminished and shipping increased, the possibility of collision with submerged wreckage became a real safety concern. The search team compiled every known Baychimo sighting going back to 1931. They plotted locations on charts. They analyzed drift patterns, using computer models to calculate probable movement based on known Arctic currents and wind patterns. They identified search areas where the wreck was most likely to be. The search utilized modern marine survey technology. Side-scan sonar can detect objects on the ocean floor by bouncing sound waves off them and analyzing the return signal. A wreck the size of the Baychimo should show up clearly on sonar if the survey passes close enough. Underwater remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, could investigate sonar contacts, providing visual confirmation. But Arctic conditions challenged even modern technology. Ice coverage limited survey seasons to brief summer windows. The vastness of the search area meant systematic coverage would take years. Weather frequently forced operations to suspend. Equipment designed for temperate waters sometimes malfunctioned in extreme cold. The 2007 search covered hundreds of square miles. The survey team detected numerous sonar contact objects on the seafloor that could potentially be the Baychimo. Each contact required investigation with ROVs. Many turned out to be other wrecks. The Arctic seafloor is littered with them. Old whaling ships, crashed aircraft, vessels from various eras. Others were rock formations or natural features that produced sonar returns resembling man-made objects. None were the Baychimo. But the search wasn't entirely unsuccessful. The project created a comprehensive database of Baychimo sightings, digitizing records that had existed only on paper or in scattered archives. This database revealed patterns invisible in individual sighting reports. The team could now see the ship's overall drift pattern with unprecedented clarity. Analysis showed the Baychimo drifted in a roughly circular pattern centered on the Beaufort Gyre. Her range extended from Point Barrow, Alaska, east to the Mackenzie River Delta in Canada, north toward the permanent ice pack, and west toward waters north of Siberia. She rarely drifted far south. The cold Arctic currents kept her in northern waters. She probably completed multiple circuits of this pattern over her 38-year drift. Based on the last confirmed sighting location and analysis of currents, the team identified the most probable sink location. If the Baychimo went down shortly after the 1969 sighting, currents would have carried her in a predictable direction. The team marked this area as highest priority for future searches. In 2008 and again in 2010, private expedition groups attempted to locate the wreck. Neither succeeded, but both contributed additional survey data. They covered areas the government search had missed. They tested new survey techniques. They refined search parameters based on improved understanding of Arctic oceanography. These private expeditions were motivated partly by historical interest and partly by potential salvage rights. Under maritime law, whoever finds and successfully salvages an abandoned wreck can claim ownership. The Baychimo, despite her deteriorated condition, had potential value as a historical artifact. Museums might be interested. Marine archaeology programs might fund excavation. There was even talk of attempting to raise her if found in shallow enough water. But all searches face the same fundamental problem. The Arctic is enormous, the Baychimo is relatively small, and the ocean floor is cluttered with potential false positives. Systematic search of even a limited area requires enormous resources. Weather restricts operations to brief periods. Ice can move in and force evacuation at any time. The cost per square mile searched is very high. In 2013, the Alaskan government officially listed the Baychimo as a navigation hazard and a priority search target. This wasn't just historical curiosity. The Arctic was changing. Climate change meant less ice coverage. Commercial shipping companies were evaluating northern routes as alternatives to traditional shipping lanes. Cruise ships were beginning to offer Arctic voyages. A large steel wreck floating just beneath the surface or grounded on a shoal could be disastrous for any vessel that struck it. The navigation hazard designation meant search funding became more available. It also meant international cooperation improved. Canada, Russia, and the United States all had interests in Arctic safety. Information sharing increased. Survey operations coordinated better. Multiple agencies and organizations contributed resources to the search. Yet despite all this, despite modern technology, comprehensive databases, well-funded search operations, international cooperation, and genuine practical need to locate the wreck, the Baychimo remains lost. No search has definitively found her. The ghost ship has vanished as thoroughly as if she never existed. Some researchers believe she's been found but not recognized. The Arctic seafloor contains countless wrecks. Side-scan sonar detects them regularly. But without distinctive features or closer examination, identifying specific wrecks is difficult. A sonar image showing twisted metal could be the Baychimo, or it could be a Soviet cargo ship, or an American military vessel, or one of dozens of other wrecks. Without visual confirmation or metal analysis, or some other definitive identification method, we simply can't know. It's also possible she's in an area that hasn't been searched yet. The Arctic is vast. Search operations have covered hundreds of square miles, but the probable search area extends thousands of square miles. Complete coverage would take decades, even with unlimited funding. The Baychimo could be just outside every area that's been surveyed, waiting to be discovered by the next search expedition. Or she could be buried. In some areas of the Arctic, sediment accumulation is rapid. A wreck could be covered by mud or sand within decades. The Baychimo might rest under several feet of sediment, invisible to sonar, undetectable unless someone drills or digs in exactly the right spot. or returning to that tantalizing possibility she could still be drifting beneath the surface. Waterlogged, suspended in the water column, at some depth where she's neither visible from above nor detectable on seafloor surveys, moving slowly with deep currents, effectively invisible to all search methods currently employed. The search continues. Every summer, when Arctic ice retreats, survey teams return to the Beaufort Sea. New technology is tested. New search areas are covered. Someday, someone will probably find her. A sonar survey will detect an anomaly. An ROV will investigate. Cameras will show rusted steel with distinctive features that confirm identification. The Baychimo's final resting place will be known, but until that day, she remains lost. The ghost ship's final trick was disappearing so completely that even modern technology cannot find her. The SS Baychimo's story transcends maritime history and adventure narrative. It speaks to fundamental truths about human limitation, natural power, and the persistence of mystery in an increasingly mapped and measured world. First and foremost, the Baychimo reminds us of human limitations. We like to think we've conquered nature through technology and planning. We build great machines. We develop sophisticated systems. We believe we can control outcomes through proper preparation. The Baychimo's story tells a different truth. She was built by experts, sailed by experienced captains, maintained according to best practices. Yet the Arctic defeated all human planning. The ship became trapped. All attempts to recover her failed. She drifted where nature took her, following patterns no human could predict or control. For 38 years, she existed beyond human influence, a demonstration that some environments remain fundamentally beyond our control. This isn't a failure of human capability, it's recognition of physical reality. The Arctic is simply too vast, too powerful, too changeable for humans to dominate completely. We can operate there. We can survive there. We can even thrive there with proper preparation. But we cannot control it. The Baychimo demonstrated this truth year after year, sighting after sighting. Second, her story illustrates the power of time and chance. The Baychimo should have sunk within weeks of abandonment. Every prediction said so. Every precedent suggested so. Arctic ice crushes ships regularly. Metal fatigues. Steel corrodes. Ships sink. That's the normal pattern. But the Baychimo didn't follow the normal pattern. She survived. Not because of superior design, plenty of stronger ships have been destroyed in Arctic conditions. Not because of divine protection, there's no evidence of anything supernatural. She survived through chance. The ice that trapped her also supported her. The currents that moved her kept her from grounding. The storms that battered her never quite exceeded her structural limits. Luck, not skill or planning, determined her fate. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge. We prefer to believe that outcomes result from human action, that success comes from good decisions and failure from bad ones. The Baychimo story suggests otherwise. Sometimes, chance matters more than anything we control. Third, the Baychimo represents the enduring power of the unknown. We live in an age of comprehensive mapping and surveillance. Satellites track ships in real time. GPS provides location to the meter. Communication is instant and global. We expect to know where things are. We assume mysteries can be solved with sufficient technology and effort. Yet we cannot find the Baychimo. Despite modern survey equipment, despite databases and search operations and international cooperation, her final location remains unknown. This simple fact that a large steel ship can be lost despite all our technology is remarkable. It demonstrates that some unknowns persist regardless of our capabilities. This unknowing is actually valuable. The world is poorer for having too few mysteries. When everything is known, catalogued, explained, something essential is lost. The Baychimo preserves mystery, not through supernatural means but through natural ones. She's lost in the old-fashioned way, by being somewhere we haven't looked thoroughly enough yet. That's genuine mystery. and it's increasingly rare. Fourth, consider what the Baychimo meant to the various people who encountered her over the decades. For Inuit hunters, she was a strange presence in their hunting grounds, a massive artifact from the industrial world, appearing and disappearing like a strange weather phenomenon. Some saw her as ill-omened. Others viewed her as simply part of the Arctic landscape, as normal as glaciers or seal colonies. For sailors and military personnel, she was a navigation hazard and a curiosity. Ship captains who encountered her filed reports and steered clear. Aircraft pilots photographed her and marveled at her persistence. She was a story to tell in port, a strange experience that broke up the routine of Arctic patrols. For salvagers, she was opportunity and frustration combined. Each sighting raised hopes of recovery and profit. Each failure to catch her provided hard lessons about Arctic conditions and human limitations. She became the ship that got away, again and again. For scientists and engineers, she was a natural experiment in ship durability. They studied reports of her condition, trying to understand what made her so remarkably tough. Her survival challenged assumptions about material science and structural engineering. She provided data that influenced ship design for decades. For Captain Cornwell and the men who served aboard her, the Baychimo represented unfinished business. Cornwell died in 1948 without knowing his ship's ultimate fate. He knew she'd been spotted multiple times. He knew she'd survived far longer than anyone predicted, but he never learned where she finally went or what happened to her. Most of the crew who served aboard her have now passed away, taking their personal memories of the ship to their graves. The Baychimo also represents a specific moment in history. She existed in a window between eras, complex enough to survive Arctic conditions, but not sophisticated enough to be tracked continuously. Modern ships carry transponders that broadcast their position constantly. Contemporary vessels can be monitored in real time from anywhere on Earth. A ship like the Baychimo couldn't drift untracked in 21st century Arctic waters. Her story was possible only in that brief period when ships were technologically advanced but communication and tracking systems were primitive. She represents the last era of genuine maritime isolation. Ships could still disappear. Vessels could still be lost. The ocean still held spaces beyond human observation. Those spaces are shrinking. The Arctic, that the Baychimo knew the world of permanent pack ice and extreme isolation, is changing rapidly due to climate change. Ice that was once year-round now melts seasonally. Routes that were impassable are becoming shipping lanes. The frozen fortress is opening. This has implications for the search. As ice diminishes, more of the Arctic seafloor becomes accessible to survey operations. Technology continues improving. Each year, search capabilities expand. The probability of finding the Baychimo increases steadily. If she still exists, if she's resting on the seafloor somewhere in surveyed depth, she will almost certainly be found eventually. The question isn't if, but when. And when that day comes, what will we learn? Her wreck will tell stories. The pattern of damage will reveal how she finally failed. The location will confirm drift models or require their revision. Physical evidence will replace speculation about her final hours, but something will also be lost. Once found, the Baychimo will no longer be the ghost ship. She'll be a documented wreck with a known location. The mystery will be solved. The story will have an ending. That ending might provide closure, but it will also diminish the legend. Perhaps that's why part of us, despite genuine practical reasons to locate the wreck, hopes she's never found. Let her remain a mystery. Let her stay lost in Arctic waters, preserving that sense of the unknown that grows rarer every year. Let her be the ship that truly became a ghost, existing more in imagination than in any physical location. The Baychimo doesn't need to be found to matter. Her story stands complete whether we ever learn her final resting place or not. She was a cargo steamer that became a legend. She was abandoned and survived. She drifted for decades, appearing and disappearing, evading all attempts at capture. And then she vanished, leaving only stories and mystery behind. That's enough. That's everything. The economics driving the Baychimo's Arctic voyages were substantial. In 1931, a single high-quality Arctic fox pelt could sell for $50 to $100 at auction, roughly equivalent to $1,500 to $3,000 today. A beaver pelt, properly prepared, might bring $30 to $60. The Baychimo's cargo on her final voyage contained thousands of pelts, representing total value in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, a fortune in Depression-era currency. This value chain started with indigenous trappers who spent brutal winter months in the Arctic wilderness, checking trap lines, processing pelts, and surviving in conditions that would kill unprepared people within hours. They brought their pelts to Hudson's Bay Company trading posts, where company factors men who lived year-round at these isolated posts evaluated quality and offered trade goods in exchange. These weren't cash transactions, this was barter. A trapper might exchange pelts for ammunition, flour, tea, tools, cloth necessities for Arctic survival. The trading posts themselves were small fortresses against the environment. Wooden buildings, insulated as well as technology allowed, heated by wood or coal stoves, stocked with goods shipped in by vessels like the Baychimo during the brief summer navigational window. The factors who ran these posts were part businessman, part diplomat, part survival expert. They needed to maintain good relations with indigenous communities, manage inventory carefully since resupply came only once a year, and survive months of isolation in conditions of extreme cold and darkness. When supply ships like the Baychimo arrived, the trading posts would load their accumulated pelts, months of trade compressed into cargo holds. The ship would proceed along the coast, visiting multiple posts until her holds were full. Then, the race south would begin, trying to clear the Arctic before winter ice closed the passages. This system worked barely because the profits justified the risks. Ships were lost, men died, but enough voyages succeeded that the trade remained profitable. The psychology of Arctic isolation deserves attention. When the Baychimo's crew found themselves trapped in October and November 1931, they faced not just physical challenges but profound psychological ones. The sun disappearing for longer each day, the endless white landscape in every direction, the knowledge that rescue was impossible until spring, the constant cold that never relented. These factors combined to create psychological pressure that could break even experienced Arctic hands. Consider what isolation meant in 1931. No internet, no satellite phones, no email. Radio communication was possible but unreliable. Messages took hours or days to transmit and receive. The men aboard the Baychimo, trapped in ice hundreds of miles from civilization, were truly alone in ways difficult to comprehend in our hyper-connected age. If something went catastrophically wrong, no help would come. They knew this. They lived with this knowledge every day. The Arctic has driven men mad. Historical records document numerous cases of Arctic hysteria, a psychological condition specific to extreme cold and isolation. Symptoms include paranoia, depression, sometimes violent behavior. The combination of physical stress, darkness, isolation, and danger creates perfect conditions for psychological breakdown. That Captain Cornwell and his crew maintained discipline and made rational decisions under these conditions speaks to their mental toughness as much as their physical endurance. The movement of Arctic pack ice follows patterns that are broadly predictable but locally chaotic. Large-scale currents like the Beaufort Gyre create circular flow patterns that persist for years. But within these large patterns, local variations create unpredictability. A storm can temporarily reverse flow, a temperature change can accelerate or slow movement, pressure from one direction can cause ice to shift in unexpected ways. This means tracking a drifting ship is extraordinarily difficult. You can predict generally where currents might carry her over months or years, but predicting exact location at any given time is nearly impossible. The Baychimo might drift 10 miles in a day, or sit motionless for a week. She might move north while the prevailing current suggests south movement, because local conditions override larger patterns. Modern computer models can simulate ice drift with reasonable accuracy over large areas and long time periods. But they can't tell you exactly where one ship will be on one specific day. The variables are too numerous, the chaotic factors too influential. This is why every search for the Baychimo has required surveying huge areas rather than targeting specific locations. She's somewhere in a region we can define broadly. But within that region, she could be anywhere. Salvage operations in Arctic waters face unique challenges that make even simple recovery attempts complex and dangerous. First, access is limited to brief summer windows when ice retreats enough to allow ship operations. This might be 6 to 10 weeks at most. Equipment and personnel must be assembled, transported to remote locations, and mobilized quickly. Any delay means missing the window entirely and waiting another year. Second, even during summer, ice conditions remain hazardous. Large ice floes still drift through channels. Storms can push ice back into cleared areas within hours. A salvage ship working a derelict can find itself threatened by closing ice, forced to abandon the operation to avoid being trapped. This happened repeatedly. With Baychimo salvage attempts, crews would locate her, begin work, then have to flee as ice conditions deteriorated. Third, the remoteness means limited resources. Specialized equipment might not be available. Support vessels are scarce. If something breaks or fails, replacements must be flown in at enormous cost, if they can be obtained at all. Every salvage attempt must be essentially self-sufficient, carrying everything that might be needed because resupply is impractical or impossible. World War II's impact on the Arctic cannot be overstated. Before the war, Arctic presence was minimal trading posts, occasional explorers, scattered indigenous communities. The war changed everything. Suddenly, the Arctic was strategically vital. The shortest route for bombers flying between America and Soviet Union crossed the Arctic. U-boats operated in Arctic waters, threatening supply convoys. Weather stations became critical for predicting conditions over Europe. This militarization meant more people in the Arctic than ever before. Military personnel, who would never normally venture into such conditions, found themselves stationed at remote Arctic bases. Aircraft that were designed for temperate climates flew Arctic patrols. Ships built for conventional warfare operated in ice-filled waters. This influx meant more eyes to spot the Baychimo, more reports of sightings, more documentation of her continued survival. It also meant more wrecks. The Arctic claimed aircraft, ships, equipment. The ocean floor accumulated debris from military operations. This would later complicate searches for the Baychimo sonar contacts that might be her, could also be any of dozens of other wrecks from the war years. The Arctic became a graveyard for military hardware, making it harder to distinguish one specific wreck from the general detritus of war. Modern shipwreck search technology is sophisticated but still limited by Arctic conditions. Side-scan sonar, the primary tool for ocean floor surveys, works by sending sound pulses downward and analyzing the returns. Solid objects like wrecks create distinctive sonar shadows. Experienced operators can often identify wreck types from sonar images alone, but Arctic conditions interfere with even this advanced technology. Ice coverage is the primary obstacle. Sonar requires clear water between survey ship and ocean floor. If ice covers the area, survey is impossible. Even during summer, when much Arctic ice retreats, some areas remain ice-covered year-round. If the Baychimo sank in one of these areas, finding her may be impossible until climate change opens these regions to survey operations. Water temperature also affects sonar performance. The extremely cold Arctic water has different acoustic properties than temperate water. Sound travels differently, creating artifacts and anomalies in sonar data. Operators must adjust equipment parameters for Arctic conditions. and even then, interpretation is more difficult than in temperate waters. A sonar contact that would be clearly identifiable as a wreck in warm water might be ambiguous in Arctic conditions. The human stories embedded in the Baychimo's tale are worth remembering. Captain Cornwell, who made reasonable decisions and still lost his ship to forces beyond control. The crew who survived abandonment and Arctic winter on foot. The Inuit hunters who spotted the ghost ship repeatedly and incorporated her into their own understanding of the Arctic. The salvagers who tried and failed, learning hard lessons about human limitations. The families of crew members who worried through long silences, who celebrated survival, who mourned when news finally came. Each person touched by the Baychimo's story carried it forward. They told others. Those people told still others. The story spread, transformed, became legend while remaining rooted in documented fact. This is how history lives, not just in official records and ship logs, but in human memory and retelling. The Baychimo matters not because she was important to history's grand narrative, but because her story resonated with people who heard it. She became meaningful through accumulated human attention and care, and now you carry the story forward. By listening to this account, by thinking about what it means, by perhaps sharing it with others, you become part of the Baychimo's ongoing existence. She's been gone for over 50 years, probably sunk, certainly vanished, but she persists in human consciousness, and as long as people remember her story, she remains somehow alive, not physically present, but culturally enduring. A ghost ship in the most profound sense, existing now more in imagination and memory than in any physical form. Let us return to the Arctic itself, to truly understand the environment that both preserved and claimed the Baychimo. When we speak of the Arctic Ocean, we're describing a body of water covering approximately 14 million square kilometers, roughly 1.5 times the size of the United States. Most of this is covered by ice, for at least part of the year. During winter, ice coverage extends to over 15 million square kilometers. During summer minimum, it retreats to around 4 to 5 million square kilometers. The Baychimo drifted through this vast frozen realm for 38 years. The ice itself is not uniform. There is first-year ice, which forms each winter and melts each summer, typically reaching thickness of 1 to 2 meters. There is multi-year ice, which survives summer melting and continues growing, reaching thickness of 3 to 4 meters or more. The oldest ice, sometimes called polar ice, can be 10 meters thick or more. These different ice types have different properties. First-year ice is relatively smooth and flat. Multi-year ice develops ridges and hummocks. Polar ice is incredibly hard, almost like rock. A ship trapped in first-year ice faces different challenges than one trapped in multi-year ice. First-year ice can be broken or pushed through with sufficient power. Multi-year ice is essentially unbreakable by ships. Even modern icebreakers avoid it when possible. The Baychimo, during her drifting years, encountered all these ice types. Sometimes she was trapped in relatively young ice that might break up and release her. Sometimes she was frozen in old, thick ice that held her fast for months. The ocean beneath the ice is not simply cold water. Arctic water has complex layering. Surface water is relatively fresh, diluted by ice melt and river runoff from Siberia and North America. This layer is coldest, approaching -2°C. Below this, Atlantic water intrudes from the south, bringing slightly warmer, saltier water at depths of 200 to 900 meters. Below that, colder, denser water forms the deep layer extending to the ocean floor, which in some areas reaches depths of over 5,000 meters. These layers matter for ship drift. Surface currents move the ice and anything frozen in it, but these surface currents don't necessarily match deeper currents. If the Baychimo was frozen in ice, she drifted with surface current. If she broke free and floated, she might drift differently depending on how deep she sat in the water. If she sank but achieved neutral buoyancy at some depth, she would drift with whatever current existed at that depth. Her path through the Arctic was determined by which water layer controlled her movement at any given time. One sighting deserves particular attention for the detail it provides. In 1947, when the Baychimo had been drifting for 16 years, an Inuit hunting party encountered her frozen in pack ice near Icy Cape, Alaska. Unlike many sightings which were brief or distant, this group spent an entire day exploring the ship. Their accounts, recorded by anthropologists studying Inuit oral history, provide perhaps the most detailed description of the Baychimo's midlife condition. The hunters approached cautiously. They'd heard stories about the ghost ship but never seen her. When they found her, she was listing about 15 degrees to starboard, held in ice that appeared solid and thick. They tested the ice carefully. Walking on Arctic ice requires constant vigilance for thin spots or cracks. Satisfied the ice was safe, they approached the ship. They entered through a damaged section of hull near the stern, where ice pressure had bent plates outward, creating an opening large enough to climb through. Inside, they found themselves in a cargo hold. The hold was empty except for drifted snow that had blown in through various openings. The steel walls were coated with frost an inch thick. They could see their breath in clouds despite being inside the ship. They found stairs leading to upper decks and climbed carefully. The metal steps were slippery with ice. On the next deck, they discovered crew quarters. These were frozen solid, bunks with blankets frozen stiff. Personal items scattered or neatly stored: books, photographs, clothing, small mementos. One cabin had playing cards frozen to a small table, apparently abandoned mid-game when the crew evacuated. Another had letters, partially written, frozen in an open drawer. The galley was particularly eerie. Pots still sat on the stove. Dishes were stacked in cabinets, plates and cups frozen together. A coffee pot sat on a counter, frozen coffee visible inside. The scene suggested hasty but not panicked departure. The crew had time to secure most things, but had left quickly enough that final meal preparations were abandoned in place. On the bridge, navigation equipment remained. The ship's wheel was frozen in place. Charts were spread on the navigation table, showing the Arctic coast. The logbook was gone, presumably taken by earlier visitors or the crew during abandonment. But other documents remained: manifests, weather reports, routine operational notes, all frozen, all preserved by cold. The hunters explored for hours, fascinated by this frozen artifact from another world. They took some items, tools that might be useful, a few personal effects that seemed interesting. Then they left, marking the location carefully. But when they reported the sighting and authorities organized to investigate months later, the Baychimo had moved again. The detailed location information was useless. She drifted away, carried by ice movements to some new unknown location. Scientists who studied reports of the Baychimo's survival were fascinated by what her endurance revealed about material science and structural engineering. Steel degrades over time through several mechanisms. Corrosion from salt water is continuous iron, combines with oxygen in seawater to form rust, weakening the metal. Stress from ice pressure creates microfractures that propagate and grow. Thermal cycling, the repeated heating and cooling that metal experiences, causes material fatigue. All these factors should have destroyed the Baychimo within years, not decades. Yet she persisted. Analysis suggests several factors contributed. First, the extreme cold actually slowed some degradation processes. Corrosion happens faster in warm water than cold. At near freezing temperatures, the chemical reactions that cause rust proceed slowly. This doesn't stop corrosion, but it delays it. Second, the ice that trapped her also protected her. When frozen solid in pack ice, the ship experienced little wave action or movement conditions that accelerate structural fatigue. The ice held her still, reducing stress. Third, her specific design provided redundancy. The double hull meant that even when outer plates failed, inner plates provided backup. The overbuilt framework distributed stress loads better than minimum specification construction would have. She was strong enough that individual component failures didn't cascade into total structural collapse. She degraded gradually rather than catastrophically. Modern naval architects who study historical Arctic vessels point to the Baychimo as an example of how conservative design saves lives and equipment. Her builders didn't know she'd spend decades abandoned in Arctic ice, but they built her strong enough that when the unexpected happened, the ship survived. This philosophy, building stronger than minimum requirements demand, has influenced subsequent Arctic vessel design. The Baychimo's survival proved that over-engineering for harsh environments isn't wasteful. It's prudent. The indigenous Inuit communities of the Arctic coast had their own relationship with the Baychimo, one that differed significantly from the perspectives of European and American sailors. For the Inuit, the Arctic was home, not a hostile wilderness to be conquered, but a landscape to be understood and respected. The sudden appearance and repeated reappearances of a large steel ship fit into their worldview differently than it fit into the maritime world's understanding. Inuit hunters who encountered the Baychimo often incorporated her into their oral traditions. Stories were told around winter fires about the ship that appeared and disappeared like a spirit. Some communities viewed her as ill-omened, a ship that trapped its crew brought bad luck. Others saw her as simply another feature of the Arctic landscape, as natural as a glacier or ice formation. Still others approached her pragmatically, boarding her when possible to salvage useful items. The Inuit relationship with metal and manufactured goods was complex in this era. Traditional Inuit culture used materials available in the Arctic: bone, stone, ivory, skins, wood when available. Metal tools and materials were valuable because they enabled tasks impossible with traditional materials. A steel knife held an edge better than stone. Metal pots could be placed directly in fire. Nails and screws allowed construction techniques impossible with sinew and bone bindings. The Baychimo, frozen and abandoned, represented a potential source of these valuable materials. Hunters who boarded her sometimes took tools, metal fittings, anything that might prove useful. This wasn't looting in any negative sense. The ship had been officially abandoned, ownership relinquished. By both maritime law and practical ethics, salvaging from an abandoned derelict was legitimate. The Inuit who took items from the Baychimo were simply making practical use of resources that would otherwise go to waste. But beyond practical salvage, the Baychimo held symbolic significance. She represented the intrusion of industrial civilization into the Arctic. She was proof that the outside world increasingly touched even the most remote regions. Traditional Inuit life was already changing in 1931 trading posts, missionaries, government administrators, schools. The Baychimo was one more symbol of this transformation. A massive steel ship, product of industrial shipyards and global commerce, drifting through waters that had known only skin boats and wooden vessels for thousands of years. Some elders warned that the ghost ship was an omen of changes to come. They were more right than they knew. Within decades, the Arctic would be transformed by military installations, oil exploration, climate change, and the steady encroachment of modern industrial civilization. The Baychimo, in retrospect, was an early warning, a sign that the old Arctic was ending and something new was beginning. The enduring appeal of the Baychimo's story raises interesting questions about why mysteries matter to us. In an age of instant information, where any question seems answerable through internet search, why do we care about an abandoned ship that disappeared decades ago? What does the story give us that documented facts and clear resolutions cannot? Perhaps mysteries serve a psychological function that goes beyond simple curiosity. They create space for imagination and speculation. When all facts are known and all questions answered, there's nowhere for imagination to operate. But when key facts remain unknown, when the Baychimo's final fate remains uncertain, imagination engages. We wonder, we speculate, we create mental scenarios. This imaginative engagement is satisfying in ways that simple fact consumption is not. Mysteries also remind us of our limitations. Modern civilization encourages the belief that we can know everything, solve every problem, answer every question through sufficient application of technology and effort. The Baychimo's continued absence challenges this assumption. Here is a large steel object, whose last known location is documented, whose probable location can be estimated, yet which remains unfound despite modern search technology. This not knowing is actually valuable. It demonstrates that the world still contains spaces beyond complete human understanding. There's also something deeply human about the Baychimo's story that resonates across cultures and generations. The ship represents human ambition, the attempt to profit from remote regions, to navigate dangerous waters, to push boundaries. She represents human vulnerability, the crew's ultimate inability to control their vessel's fate, the failure of all recovery attempts. She represents human persistence, the repeated efforts to find and salvage her despite consistent failure. And she represents human limitation, the final acknowledgement that some things escape our grasp no matter how hard we try. These themes are universal. Every person understands ambition, vulnerability, persistence, and limitation from personal experience. The Baychimo's story, while specific in its details, speaks to these universal human experiences. That's why people who've never been to the Arctic, who've never worked on ships, who have no direct connection to maritime history, still find the story compelling. It reflects fundamental truths about what it means to be human in a world we cannot fully control. The Baychimo's story gains new relevance in the context of climate change and the rapidly transforming Arctic. The Arctic that the Baychimo knew, the frozen ocean covered by permanent pack ice, accessible only during brief summer windows, is disappearing. Ice coverage has declined dramatically in recent decades. Summer minimums that would have been unthinkable in 1931 are now routine. The Arctic is warming at twice the global average rate, transforming an environment that seemed eternal and unchanging. This transformation has profound implications for finding the Baychimo. Areas that were previously ice-covered year-round are now accessible to survey operations during summer. Waters that were too dangerous for systematic search are becoming navigable. If the Baychimo rests on the ocean floor in depths accessible to modern survey equipment, the increasing ice-free periods make eventual discovery more likely. But there's bitter irony here. The same climate change that might allow us to find the Baychimo is destroying the Arctic that created her story. The conditions that preserved her for decades, the extreme cold, the extensive ice coverage, the isolation, are diminishing. Future generations will read about the Baychimo drifting through vast expanses of pack ice, and they'll be reading about an Arctic that no longer exists. The Baychimo also serves as an accidental marker of Arctic change. Her documented drift pattern from 1931 to 1969 provides a record of ice movements and conditions during that period. Scientists studying historical ice coverage have used Baychimo sighting records to help reconstruct ice patterns. Where she was spotted tells us where ice conditions allowed drift. Where she wasn't spotted for extended periods tells us about areas of heavy ice coverage. Her 3-decade journey mapped Arctic ice dynamics in ways that were unintentional but scientifically valuable. If she's eventually found, her wreck will provide additional data. The pattern of ice damage on her hull will show forces she encountered. The depth at which she rests will indicate where she was when she finally sank. Her location will confirm or revise models of Arctic current patterns. Even in death, the Baychimo will teach us about the Arctic environment. The legal status of the Baychimo raises interesting questions about maritime law, salvage rights, and what happens when vessels are abandoned in international waters. When the Hudson's Bay Company officially abandoned the ship in December 1931, they relinquished ownership. Under maritime law, this made the Baychimo derelict property abandoned and ownerless. Derelict vessels can be claimed by anyone who successfully salvages them. This is ancient maritime law rooted in practical necessity. Ships adrift pose navigation hazards. Salvage operations are expensive and dangerous. The law provides incentive by granting salvage rights to whoever succeeds in recovery. If someone had managed to reach the Baychimo, board her, and tow her to port, they could claim ownership regardless of who originally built or owned her. But successful salvage requires bringing the vessel under control and taking it to port. Merely finding a wreck doesn't grant ownership. Boarding her temporarily doesn't grant ownership. Multiple people boarded the Baychimo over the years: Captain Cornwell's salvage crew, Leslie Melvin, the Inuit hunters, various others. None brought her under control or towed her to safety, so none acquired legal ownership. She remained derelict, ownerless, available to whoever could successfully salvage her. If the Baychimo were found today, similar principles would apply with some complications. If she's resting on the seafloor, she's technically still derelict and potentially salvageable. However, many nations now have laws protecting historic shipwrecks. A wreck nearly a century old might qualify for protection, restricting salvage operations. Additionally, location matters. If she's in territorial waters of Alaska, Canada, or Russia, that nation's laws apply. If she's in international waters, international maritime law governs. The practical reality is that salvaging the Baychimo, even if found, would likely be economically irrational. She has minimal scrap value. Historic interest might attract museum or research funding, but not enough to cover the enormous costs of Arctic salvage operations. She would probably be documented, studied, and left where she rests, a practice increasingly common with historic wrecks. The discovery itself would be valuable. Physical recovery would be prohibitively expensive and arguably unnecessary. As we near the end of this journey through the Baychimo's story, consider what we've learned not just about one ship, but about human nature and our relationship with the unknown. The Baychimo succeeded in becoming immortal not through achievement or importance, but through mystery. She's remembered not for what she did, but for what happened to her. Her fame rests not on accomplishment, but on absence. This says something profound about how stories work and why they persist. We remember things that engage our imagination. Facts alone rarely endure. They're recorded, filed, forgotten. But mysteries persist because they invite ongoing engagement. Each person who learns about the Baychimo wonders where she ended up. That wondering keeps the story alive. As long as people wonder, the Baychimo exists not just as historical fact, but as living story. The ship herself, wherever she actually rests, is almost beside the point now. The physical Baychimo is gone, probably deteriorated beyond recognition. But the story Baychimo persists, renewed with each telling, transformed slightly by each teller, passed forward through time like a living thing. This is how legends work. They transcend their origins. They become more than mere facts. They become part of human culture. And so the Baychimo drifts, still not in Arctic waters, but in the realm of story and memory. She sails through conversations and articles, through documentaries and books, through quiet speculations and earnest research. She's become eternal by becoming mysterious. She's achieved a kind of immortality by remaining lost. Perhaps that's the greatest trick of all. Perhaps that's what makes her, finally and forever, the true ghost ship of the Arctic. The ongoing search for the Baychimo represents one of the most sustained efforts to locate a single historic shipwreck in maritime history. Unlike searches for famous vessels like the Titanic or Bismarck, which captured global attention and massive resources for brief, intensive efforts, the Baychimo search has proceeded incrementally over decades, with various organizations and individuals contributing pieces to the puzzle. Modern search methodology begins with historical research. Teams compile every known sighting, plotting them on charts. They analyze reported positions, ice conditions at time of sighting, weather patterns, anything that might help predict drift patterns. Computer models simulate ocean currents and ice movements, calculating probable paths the ship might have followed. This creates probability zones, areas where the wreck is more likely to be based on known information and physical modeling. These probability zones are large, often thousands of square kilometers. Within these zones, systematic survey requires covering every square meter with sonar. A typical sonar survey might cover 1 to 5 square kilometers per day, depending on water depth, weather, ice conditions, and equipment capabilities. Covering a probability zone of several thousand square kilometers requires months or years of continuous survey operations. In the Arctic, where operations are limited to brief summer windows, this means decades of intermittent work. The economics of such searches are challenging. Survey ships cost thousands of dollars per day to operate. Fuel, crew salaries, equipment maintenance, supplies all accumulate rapidly. A single summer season of Arctic survey operations might cost hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. Without clear commercial value in finding the wreck, funding is difficult. Government agencies, universities, and private organizations must be convinced that the search serves scientific, historical, or practical purposes worth the investment. Future search efforts will likely employ increasingly sophisticated technology. Autonomous underwater vehicles can operate independently for days or weeks, covering large areas without human supervision. Multiple AUVs operating simultaneously could cover search areas far faster than traditional ship-based sonar surveys. Climate change will ironically assist the search as Arctic ice coverage declines and more areas become accessible to survey operations for longer periods each year. The question isn't whether the Baychimo will be found, but when. Technological capability continues improving. Arctic accessibility continues increasing. Eventually, someone will detect a sonar anomaly, send down an ROV to investigate, and find rusted steel with features matching the Baychimo's configuration. That day will mark the end of one mystery and the beginning of answers to questions that have persisted for over 8 decades. But until that day, the mystery persists. The ghost ship remains lost, and we are left with a story that is fundamentally incomplete, unsatisfying in its lack of resolution, but compelling precisely because of that incompleteness. The unknown invites engagement in ways the known never does. The Baychimo's greatest achievement is remaining lost long enough to transform from ordinary cargo vessel into extraordinary legend. Her story reminds us that mystery has value, that not knowing can be as significant as knowing. In this age of instant information and comprehensive surveillance, the Baychimo offers something increasingly precious: proof that the world still contains spaces beyond our complete knowledge. She exists at the edge of human awareness, reminding us that some boundaries still exist between the known and unknown. And so we end where we began in the Arctic, in the ice, in the mystery. The Baychimo drifts through our imagination, as she once drifted through Arctic waters. She evades our complete understanding as she once evaded all attempts at capture. The ghost ship endures, not despite being lost, but because she remains lost. Her absence is her presence. Her mystery is her meaning. Her incompleteness is, strangely, what makes her whole. Let us trace more carefully what we know about specific years of the Baychimo's drift, year by year, to understand the pattern of her movements and the gradual accumulation of knowledge about her fate. 1932, her first full year adrift, brought multiple sightings that established the pattern. March brought Ronald Coates's encounter. July brought reports from Inuit hunters. November brought Leslie Melvin's boarding. Each sighting confirmed she was still out there, still afloat, moving through a roughly circular pattern in the Beaufort Sea. 1933 saw fewer reported sightings, but this likely reflects reporting gaps rather than absence of encounters. Many people who spotted the Baychimo had no immediate way to report it. They might be isolated hunters or prospectors who wouldn't reach settlements with radio capability for weeks or months. By the time they reported sightings, the information was old enough to be nearly useless for salvage purposes. Some sightings probably went unreported entirely. People who saw the derelict noted it mentally, but never formally documented the encounter. 1934 through 1938 saw steady trickle of sightings. Ship captains operating in Arctic waters knew to watch for the Baychimo. She was marked on navigation charts as a drifting hazard. Pilots of the few aircraft operating in the Arctic kept alert for her. Her fame spread. The ghost ship became known not just in Arctic communities but in maritime circles globally. Newspaper articles appeared. Maritime journals published analyses. The ship that should have sunk years ago became a minor celebrity through her stubborn refusal to disappear. The war years of 1939 through 1945 brought increased military presence and therefore increased sighting frequency. Military vessels and aircraft encountered her repeatedly. The Soviet icebreaker, boarding in 1940, provided particularly detailed documentation. American and Canadian forces spotted her multiple times. Each military sighting was professionally documented with precise positions, conditions, and detailed descriptions. This military documentation gave us our best record of the Baychimo's midlife condition. The late 40s and 50s brought continued sightings as Arctic activity increased with Cold War military operations and expanding commercial interest. The 1956 grounding and extensive exploration by oil prospectors provided what many consider the most complete description of her late-stage deterioration. By this time, nearly quarter century after abandonment, the cumulative effects of ice damage, weather exposure, and simple time had created obvious structural problems. Yet she still floated, still drifted, still refused to sink. The 60s brought declining sighting frequency and increasing reports of severe deterioration. The 1962 description as barely floating, listing badly, suggested the end was near. The 1964 Soviet photographs showed a vessel clearly in distress. The 1969 final sighting described a ship on the verge of foundering. Then silence. No more sightings, no more reports. The Baychimo had finally, after 38 years, reached her limit. This year-by-year progression tells a story of gradual degradation and remarkable endurance. Each year that passed should have been her last. Each winter should have crushed her. Each summer should have seen her swamped and sunk. Yet year after year, she persisted. The accumulated probability of survival decreased exponentially. Surviving 1 year was unlikely. Surviving 10 years was extraordinary. Surviving 38 years was essentially impossible according to conventional wisdom. Yet, it happened. The impossible became real through the simple mechanism of not sinking, year after year, until finally the accumulated damage exceeded even her remarkable toughness. The comparison between the Baychimo's fate and other Arctic vessels provides useful perspective. The Jeannette, trapped in ice in 1879, was crushed and sank within 2 years. The Karluk, trapped in 1913, sank within months. The Maud, intentionally frozen into ice for research purposes in the 1920s, required constant maintenance to survive. Ships designed specifically for Arctic conditions, maintained by crews, still struggled to survive extended ice entrapment. The Baychimo, abandoned without maintenance, outlasted them all. This exceptional survival demands explanation beyond simple luck. Several factors combined uniquely. Her construction quality exceeded minimum standards significantly. Her double hull provided redundancy that single-hull vessels lacked. Her reinforced framework distributed stress better than conventional designs. Her icebreaker bow reduced ice pressure forces. These design advantages, combined with favorable drift patterns that avoided the worst ice pressures and avoided grounding on hidden shoals, allowed survival that defied normal expectations. But we must also acknowledge the role of randomness. The Baychimo could have been crushed on any of thousands of occasions. She drifted through conditions that destroyed other ships. That she survived suggests not destiny or protection, but simply the random chance that catastrophic conditions never quite occurred at times and places where she was vulnerable. Probability suggests she should have been destroyed. Reality demonstrates she wasn't. This gap between probable and actual encapsulates the mystery and the miracle of her 3-decade survival. We began this journey in July 1931, watching the SS Baychimo depart Vancouver on what would be her final voyage. We followed her north through dangerous waters, into pack ice near Point Barrow. We witnessed her crew's abandonment during that November blizzard. And then we tracked her ghost through 38 years of sightings, encounters, attempts at recovery, and eventual disappearance. The story has no neat conclusion. There is no final chapter where everything is explained and resolved. The Baychimo's fate remains unknown. She probably sank sometime after 1969, that's the logical conclusion. A ship in her reported condition couldn't survive much longer. The Arctic, which had preserved her for decades, finally claimed her. But we don't know this for certain, and that uncertainty is central to what makes the story compelling. We live in an age that demands resolution. Every story should have an ending. Every mystery should be solved. Every question should have an answer. The Baychimo refuses this expectation. She ends with uncertainty, with possibilities, with questions that may never be answered. What we know for certain is this. For 38 years, a steel ship built to carry pelts through Arctic waters became something far more than a ship. She became a phenomenon. She appeared to dozens of people, hunters, sailors, prospectors, soldiers, scientists. She was photographed, documented, boarded, measured. She appeared in ship logs from multiple nations. She was real. Her existence is undeniable. And she was never caught. Despite numerous attempts, despite modern technology, despite everything humans could bring to bear, the Baychimo evaded capture. She drifted where nature took her, following patterns beyond human prediction or control. The ghost ship earned her name through natural means: ice drift, poor timing, vast distances, limited communications, but the effect was the same as if she were supernatural. She was uncatchable. Think about what this means. In an era when we track everything, when satellites can read license plates from orbit, when GPS provides location to the meter, we cannot find a 230-foot steel ship. She's somewhere in a known region. We have comprehensive records of her movements. We've conducted systematic searches. Yet she remains lost. This tells us something important about the limits of human knowledge and control. We like to think we've mastered the natural world. We build great machines. We develop sophisticated systems. We map every surface, measure every distance, catalogue every species. And yet a ship can disappear in the Arctic and stay disappeared for over 50 years. The ocean keeps secrets despite all our technology. The people who encountered the Baychimo are nearly all gone now. Captain Cornwell died in 1948, never learning what finally happened to his ship. The crew who served aboard her have passed away. The hunters who spotted her, the sailors who photographed her, the prospectors who boarded her most are gone. Their first-hand accounts exist in documents and archives, but the living memory is fading. In another generation, no one will remember the Baychimo from personal experience. She'll be purely historical, a story documented in records, a legend preserved in books and articles. The transition from living memory to history is always bittersweet. Something vital is lost when the last person who experienced an event directly is gone. But perhaps this is fitting. The Baychimo was always more legend than reality, even when she was being actively sighted. The gap between reports, months or years, meant she existed more as story than as physical presence. People talked about her more than they saw her. Her reputation exceeded her reality, and her reputation was remarkable. She was the ship that wouldn't sink, the derelict that couldn't be caught, the ghost ship of the Arctic. These descriptions carried power. They captured imagination. They transformed a mundane cargo steamer into something legendary. Why do stories like this matter? Why does the Baychimo, a ship that served no great historical purpose, and accomplished nothing of particular significance, capture our attention decades after her disappearance. Perhaps because she represents something increasingly rare, genuine mystery, not puzzle to be solved, not problem requiring technical solution, but true mystery, something unknown that might remain unknown. In a world where every question seems answerable with sufficient research, where every mystery seems solvable with proper technology, the Baychimo offers something different. She offers not knowing, and not knowing, it turns out, has its own value. Mystery creates space for imagination. When everything is known and explained, imagination has no room to operate. But when something remains unknown, imagination engages. We wonder, we speculate, we imagine possibilities. The Baychimo, by remaining lost, remains imaginatively alive in ways that a found wreck never could be. There's also something deeply human about her story. The Baychimo represents human ambition, the attempt to operate in hostile environments, to turn profit from remote regions, to push boundaries. She represents human vulnerability, the way even our best machines can be overwhelmed by natural forces. She represents human persistence, the repeated attempts to recover her, the refusal to simply give up. And she represents human limitations, the ultimate inability to control outcomes despite our best efforts. These are universal themes. Every person understands ambition, vulnerability, persistence, and limitation. The Baychimo's story resonates because it reflects these fundamental aspects of human experience on a grand scale. The Arctic itself becomes a character in this story, perhaps the most important character. The ice, the currents, the storms, the vast distances, these aren't passive setting but active forces. The Arctic preserved the Baychimo when it could have destroyed her. It moved her when humans wanted her to stay still. It hid her when searchers wanted to find her. And ultimately, it claimed her when her time was done. We often speak of nature as if it has intent, as if it makes choices. This is metaphor, obviously. The Arctic doesn't think or plan. But the metaphor persists because it captures something true. Natural forces operate according to their own patterns, indifferent to human desires. The Baychimo's story is fundamentally about this indifference. She drifted where ice and current took her. She survived or failed based on conditions beyond human influence. The Arctic didn't care whether she sank or floated, was found or lost. And in that indifference lies a kind of terrible beauty. The changes coming to the Arctic add another layer to the story. Climate change is transforming the region rapidly. Ice coverage diminishes yearly, temperatures rise, weather patterns shift. The Arctic that preserved the Baychimo for decades is different from the Arctic of today, and tomorrow's Arctic will be different still. This means the Baychimo, if she rests on the sea floor, exists in a changing environment. The ice that once covered her location year-round may now be seasonal. Areas that were inaccessible to survey operations may now be reachable. The probability of discovery increases with every passing year. Climate change, tragic in so many ways, might provide the answer to the Baychimo mystery. But whether she's found or not, whether we ever learn her precise fate or not, the Baychimo has already achieved something remarkable. She's become eternal through disappearance, famous through absence, legendary through mystery. Her name is known, her story is told. She exists in human culture in ways that most ships never do. Ships are built, ships sail, ships serve their purpose, ships are scrapped or sunk. That's the normal pattern. The Baychimo followed this pattern until November 1931. Then she departed from it entirely. She became something other than a normal ship, something that existed in the space between reality and legend, between documented fact and imaginative possibility. The fog that swallowed her in 1969 still drifts across Arctic waters. The ice still grinds and shifts. The currents still flow in patterns that might, even now, be moving her remains. And the story continues, passed from generation to generation, about the ship that became a ghost and then became immortal. Somewhere in the Beaufort Sea on the bottom or suspended in deep water, scattered into fragments or still remarkably intact, the SS Baychimo rests. She has found the peace that eluded her in life, the stillness that drift denied her. The Arctic that moved her for decades has finally let her stop. Or perhaps she hasn't stopped. Perhaps even now she drifts, following currents too deep for any observer to detect, moving through darkness that no light penetrates, continuing her journey through water so cold it seems solid. The ghost ship, still ghosting, still evading, still defying prediction and expectation, we'll probably never know. And perhaps that's exactly right. Perhaps the Baychimo earned her mystery. Perhaps after 38 years of appearing when unexpected and disappearing when pursued, she deserves to make her final disappearance permanent. Perhaps the Arctic, which hosted her for so long, has earned the right to keep her secret. The SS Baychimo was a cargo steamer built in 1921 to haul pelts through dangerous waters. She became a legend that transcends maritime history. She was a ship that refused to sink, a derelict that couldn't be caught, a ghost that haunted Arctic waters for nearly 4 decades, and then she vanished, leaving behind only stories, photographs, official reports, and questions that may never be answered. That's her legacy. Not the pelts she carried or the routes she sailed, but the mystery she became. In an age that increasingly lacks genuine mysteries, the Baychimo preserves one. She reminds us that some things remain unknown, some questions resist answers, some mysteries endure. And so the ghost ship drifts, still not in Arctic waters perhaps, but in human imagination, in the space between the known and the unknowable, between what was documented and what remains hidden. She drifts through stories and speculation, through research and wonder, through the fog of time that obscures details while preserving legend. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the frozen north, following the SS Baychimo from her construction through her abandonment and her decades of drift to her final disappearance. I hope this exploration has given you a sense of the Arctic's vastness, the power of natural forces that dwarf human ambitions, and the enduring appeal of mysteries that resist resolution. The Baychimo's story reminds us that the world still contains spaces beyond complete human understanding. Despite our technology, despite our maps, despite our confidence in our ability to know and track everything, some things escape us. Some ships drift beyond reach, some mysteries refuse solution. In this age of instant communication and comprehensive surveillance, where privacy is scarce and secrecy is difficult, the Baychimo offers something increasingly precious: proof that unknown spaces still exist. Not supernatural spaces, not magical realms, but simple physical locations that we haven't yet thoroughly explored. The ocean floor, the deep Arctic, the places our technology hasn't quite reached. These spaces are shrinking. Each year, more of the ocean is mapped, more of the Arctic is surveyed, more mysteries are solved. That's progress, and it's valuable. But something is lost when every mystery is solved, when every unknown becomes known. The Baychimo, by remaining lost, preserves that sense of mystery. She keeps alive the possibility that some things can still escape human grasp. Until our next journey into history's mysteries, I wish you curiosity that leads to discovery, wonder that enriches understanding, and appreciation for those mysteries that may never be fully solved. The Baychimo drifts in imagination now, and there she'll remain a ghost ship forever, voyaging through the space between the known and the unknowable. Good night.